They had placed a single glass beside the untouched plate, as though the mere suggestion of Dr. Adrian Kestrel might conjure him from whatever hidden corner of Oxford he had chosen for exile. I watched the candlelight wick and bend beneath a restless draught, throwing shadows along the tablecloth like the lines of some unfinished poem. It is never the empty seats that draw attention in these ancient dining halls, but the one that refuses to be forgotten. They raised a toast, naturally. "To Kestrel's swift return," murmured the master, his voice smeared with that tone people adopt when their concern is already turning brittle. The words drifted across the high table like a fallen napkin that no one wished to pick up. I raised my glass too, more from duty than conviction, and I found myself looking at the chair again. Heavy oak, cushioned in dark red, a small tear in the upholstery near the right arm. The sort of detail that lingers long after a person leaves. Lewis leaned toward me, elbow brushing the sleeve of my coat. He had a talent for noticing what I wished to hide. Boredom, suspicion, vague irritation with the performance of academic life. He muttered that they were trying too hard. I answered, without speaking aloud, that Oxford is nothing if not expert at denying the obvious. The hall smelled of roast meat cooling too quickly and wine poured earlier than any of them would care to admit. Portraits of former luminaries stared down with the frozen hauteur of those who died believing themselves misunderstood. I felt a kinship with them, though I wasn't ready to admit that to anyone, least of all myself. A young don with an enviable head of hair attempted conversation. He spoke of Hardy's elegies, though he managed to misremember the final line of one. I let it pass. I had been listening instead to the small dissonances surrounding the absent man. The senior fellow who called him Adrian with a familiarity he had never once displayed in Kestrel's presence. The bursar, whose fork paused mid-air each time the disappearance was mentioned, and above all, the scholar of medieval verse whose laugh sounded forced, like a rhyme that falls just short of a cadence. The master remarked, far too casually, that Dr. Kestrel must have taken sudden leave for urgent personal matters. The rest of the table nodded in unison, a choir of agreement rehearsed to the point of fatigue. Yet something in their eyes betrayed impatience, as though Kestrel's continued absence were a discourtesy. The city does not tolerate those who slip beyond its sight for long. Lewis, determined to introduce some practicality into the evening, asked when Kestrel had last been seen. A long silence poured itself into the gaps between plates. Eventually, a woman in a charcoal suit, Professor Harridan, remarked that she had glimpsed him 2 nights ago, crossing the quad with his scarf trailing behind like a forgotten line of verse. But she said it too quickly, and I have learned the difference between memory and hope. There was more wine. Burgundy, good enough to mask unease if one drank fast enough. I sipped slowly, which made me perennially out of step with the rest of the room. I gazed again at the chair, sensing its quiet defiance. A man is often most fully present where he is no longer expected to be. And in a place like this, where reputations are built upon precision, the imprecise nature of vanishing leaves a mark more indelible than blood. Dinner followed its ritual arc. Latin grace, polite laughter, a dessert too sweet for my liking. Through it all, I kept circling back to the last conversation I had shared with Kestrel. 2 weeks prior in the Bodleian. He had been puzzling over a crossword, complaining under his breath that the setter had confused brevity with wit. One clue, he pointed out, seemed suspiciously easy. 6 letters. Missing. He had scrawled the answer too quickly, leaving the page smudged. Absent. He tapped his pen twice as though sealing some private agreement with fate. When the candles guttered lower and the academic masks began to crack around the edges, Lewis nudged me again. Time to leave. The master thanked us profusely. Detectives at dinner always serve a purpose, even when their wine glasses remain half empty. I nodded, collecting my coat. But before following Lewis toward the archway, I allowed myself one final look back. Most seats remained warm from the bodies that had occupied them. Only the empty one seemed cold. A chill had pooled there, patient as a secret. Someone had angled the silverware with almost loving symmetry. A napkin had been folded into perfect alignment. Every trace of Kestrel lingered without the man himself. I stepped out into the quad, night air tasting of mist and stone. The ancient bell tolled somewhere distant, as though marking time for a man who no longer cared to keep it. And in that moment, with the echo still trembling in the dark, I understood something quietly. Absence makes noise, if one has the ears to hear it. The morning after that dinner, with its hollow toasts and forced conviviality, arrived with rain that seemed determined to wash the entire city into the river. I found myself in the lodge of St. Bartholomew's, the wooden counter sticky from decades of polish and spilled tea. Lewis held a small envelope between his fingers, as though afraid it might stain him merely by touch. For a moment, I simply listened to the porter explain that the letter had appeared in Dr. Kestrel's pigeonhole sometime during the night. No one saw who placed it there, he insisted, though he said it with the defensive urgency of a man who suspects failure in his own vigilance. Oxford's porters pride themselves on omniscience. It unnerves them when the world intrudes unannounced. Lewis handed me the envelope. I could feel the ink before I saw it. Too heavy. The paper buckled where the pen had paused, each stroke burdened with unnecessary insistence. There are letters written to convey messages, and others written to prevent silence from becoming intolerable. This belonged to the latter category. Inside, a single line, drowning in the dark. Time changes everything, except memories. A familiar phrase, but wrong. Wrong by a word. Hardy had written, "Time changes everything, except that which we carry within." This version betrayed a mind either careless or too clever by half. I considered the possibility that it was both. The signature had been struck through to illegibility by another tide of ink. Anonymity is often a coward's mask, but sometimes it is a clue in its own right. The writer wanted the message to be noticed, but not the hand that delivered it. People think secrecy protects intention. I've found it often reveals fear. Lewis muttered that it looked like a lover's note. He wasn't wrong. But love leaves marks of a different kind. This was not longing, it was warning dressed as sentiment, the way one might offer flowers already wilting. I studied the envelope again, damp at its edges, not from the rain outside, but as though it had been handled by someone with unsteady, sweating fingers. And then a small detail, a faint impression left by the pressure of writing, visible only when tilted toward the lodge's yellow bulb. A second sentence once existed there, but had been scraped away with a blade. Whoever wrote this had reconsidered honesty. We stepped back into the rain. The quadrangle, deserted at this hour, felt like a courtyard of abandoned confessions. I watched the water run in narrow streams along the stones as if hurrying to escape something unpleasant. Lewis asked what Hardy had to do with Kestrel's disappearance. I told him that when a man devotes his life to studying poems about death and regret, he rarely leaves without composing an epilogue first. Kestrel was no exception. His mind was a cathedral built of meticulous references. He would not misquote Hardy unless he wished to lead us somewhere, or someone wished to mislead us entirely. We sought shelter under the cloister. Students passed, heads bowed beneath umbrellas like penitents bearing private burdens. Oxford has always been a city of brilliant secrets. Some tended, others suffocated. I unfolded the letter again. The blotting of ink pooled around the misquoted phrase, obscuring intent, but it also darkened one particular word more than the others. Memories. Stressed almost obsessively, like the pressing of a thumb into an old bruise. Kestrel had been too young to retreat into nostalgia. Yet there had been something in his eyes that last time in the Bodleian, an absence of light rather than its reflection. He had stared at the crossword before him as if it were a verdict. "Missing," he had said. 6 letters. And in his notebooks, he had circled that same word repeatedly. Lewis suggested that the letter writer might be Helena Duval, the poet whose guilt lived so close to the surface. One hardly needed intuition to find it. But Helena's handwriting was delicate, almost girlish. This letter bore the aggression of someone who needed their presence felt even while remaining invisible. We stood silently a moment longer. Rain ticked against the stone like fingernails tapping impatiently. The envelope remained in my hand, a flimsy artifact clinging to secrets far heavier than its weight allowed. The porter had insisted no stranger entered the lodge overnight, which meant the writer belonged inside these walls. Fear, then, was not of exposure from the outside world, but from those who shared their air. I slipped the letter into my pocket. There were questions to ask, yes, but more importantly, silences to hear. People speak most clearly when they are trying not to. As we turned away, I glanced back toward the lodge. The porter was wiping the counter, his shoulders hunched not from age but from worry that he had failed in guarding the boundaries of the known world. And in that moment, with the rain softening into a reluctant drizzle, I understood something faint but enduring. Some messages are not written to be answered. They're written to ensure we start looking in the wrong direction. Helena Duval lived on the top floor of a residence that smelled faintly of damp wool and the disappointed dreams of its academic tenants. The staircase complained at every step, as though protesting the weight of our reasons for climbing it. Lewis went ahead, but it was I who paused outside her door, listening. Silence has textures. Hers was brittle. When she opened the door, the contrast struck me. Her eyes, astonishingly dark beneath hair that might once have been carefully brushed, gave the impression she had not slept for days. She greeted us with the kind of politeness that is all veneer, the thin gloss over a splintering truth. She gestured toward 2 chairs that looked as though they had forgotten what comfort meant. We sat. Her desk drew my attention more quickly than any of her words. Paper scattered like feathers after a storm. Verses crossed out with violent strokes, lines rewritten and then rejected again. Half-empty bottles of cheap wine lingered near the rim of a forgotten plate. A framed photograph faced down, turned away from us deliberately. I wondered whose face she could no longer risk meeting. Lewis asked when she last saw Dr. Kestrel. She answered too easily. Days ago, she hardly kept track. He had grown distant. She assumed his absence was voluntary. Each sentence arrived pre-polished. But even the most polished lie leaves an edge. I watched her fingers, tapping irregularly against her knee, tapping the rhythm of anxiety rather than memory. She noticed my gaze drifting to the photograph. Her voice tightened, telling me it was nothing important. But I've learned that the most important things are those people insist do not matter. Without asking, I reached for it and lifted it just enough to see. Group of smiling students, blurred by poor camera focus, and one face burned out with a cigarette end. Carefully done. Deliberately erased. A poet forgetting her rhyme is one thing. A poet forgetting a person, that is another. Helena inhaled sharply, suggesting that the scorched absence was not a mistake. She said she had been foolish once, that admiration can turn corrosive when directed at the wrong man. I let her continue, noticing how her gaze flickered every time Kestrel's name arose. Not with love, but with something sharpened by regret. She spoke of nights spent arguing over stanzas, of Kestrel's infuriating precision. He corrected her quotations, straightened her metaphors, trimmed her excess. She resented him for it. She needed him for it. Intellect can be a cruel lover. It demands constant proving. While she talked, my eye caught a scrap of paper pinned above her desk, A line, written in ink less heavy than that of the letter we'd found earlier. "I remember you wrong on purpose. It was the kind of confession only poets allow themselves to write, the kind that reveals more than intended." Lewis gently asked whether Kestrel had seemed troubled. Helena almost laughed, a brittle sound. "Troubled," she murmured, "is too mild a word." He had been haunted, by work, by something unsaid. Yet she insisted she knew nothing of where he had gone. But the tremor in her voice contradicted the certainty in her words. I studied the bookshelves lining her narrow room, well-thumbed volumes of Hardy, Houseman, Donne, familiar company for lovers of sorrow. One spine caught my attention. An anthology opened not quite straight, as though closed too quickly. The page edges bore the imprint of a thumb and the slightest smudge of ink. I rose, drew it free, and Helena tensed. The poem was one of Hardy's laments about a woman lost beneath water, remembered imperfectly by the man who failed her. A small X marked a stanza. "Where memory dims the river's flow, absence deepens undertow." The ink used there mirrored the ink from the letter. Same thickness, same impatience. A detail so tiny no ordinary observer might care. But I have never considered myself ordinary. Helena's shoulders slumped when she realized what I had noticed. She whispered that she had written Kestrel a letter when he stopped responding to her messages. She confessed this quickly. Too quickly, and she claimed she had thrown it away. Yet the ink on this open book contradicted that. Letters never fully disappear. They simply change shape. She asked if we believed Kestrel was in danger. I told her that those who vanish often leave behind unfinished conversations. She looked away then, as though hearing an accusation I had not spoken aloud. We left her room with the rain beginning again, pattering against the skylight above the stairwell. Lewis remarked that Helena was hiding more than heartbreak. I said nothing. I simply replayed her earlier words and the photograph, turned downward, and the burned-out face of the forgotten. Poets rarely forget their rhymes. They forget their guilt instead. The porter produced the bundle with a gravity usually reserved for holy relics. 4 keys on a ring, their brass teeth dulled by years of academic repetition. He said they had been found wrapped in newspaper, left neatly atop his counter before dawn. He insisted he had not slept, that no one could have slipped in without his notice. Yet there they were, unexplained and gleaming faintly beneath the lodge's tired bulb. Lewis asked whose hands had returned them, but the porter's silence was apology enough. I held the ring myself. The keys were warm, as though not long removed from a pocket, and faintly scented with damp river air rather than the staleness of locked rooms. A man does not abandon his keys unless he believes he will never need them again. Lewis wondered aloud whether Kestrel might have simply decided to vanish. I knew better. People who intend to disappear rarely tidy up after themselves. We crossed the quad to Kestrel's staircase, a narrow brick wedge where the stone walls sweated moisture and time. His room greeted us like a library that had forgotten laughter. The curtains remained drawn, but daylight made a thin attempt at entering. Diffused through a veil of dust, it edged the bookshelves like a hesitant confession. I unlocked the door. A quiet click that felt strangely final. Inside, the order was unnerving. Books aligned with military precision, records stacked alphabetically by composer, a teacup cleaned and placed upside down upon its saucer. Men who leave abruptly do not tidy their thoughts so neatly. And yet there was an austerity to the scene that suggested Kestrel had been trying to hold chaos at bay, or conceal it. Lewis rummaged with the caution of a man expecting to disturb ghosts. I moved more slowly. I've always believed a room speaks when one does not interrupt. On the desk lay his crossword, the same puzzle he had shown me in the Bodleian. Entirely blank, save one entry. 6 letters. Absent, not written, but carved into the page with the pressure of a mind that refused to admit uncertainty. Beneath it, a faint rub of eraser dust, as though he had written a different word first and then changed his mind. Missing, perhaps, or lost. The difference matters. Lewis opened a drawer and found the envelope, torn nearly in half, its contents removed. Inside remained only a narrow strip of paper showing the frayed bottom of a newspaper clipping. The fragment held part of a headline, "Woman Found." The rest, discarded or hidden. Newspapers are filled with lives distilled into print-sized tragedies. Kestrel kept a piece of one, meaning it weighed on him. I placed the fragment beside the crossword, absent, "Woman Found." The beginnings of a narrative whispered between lines. On a hook by the door, his spare coat hung untouched, pockets empty. He had left with only what he carried in his mind. Men preoccupied by guilt travel lightly. I asked Lewis to check the windows. Locked from the inside. No sign of forced entry. The room was a sealed confession. Near the bed stood a small side table. On it, a record sleeve. Schubert's Winterreise, a cycle about wandering without destination. I turned it over, carefully, and noticed the corner of a folded map tucked behind the cover art. Not of Oxford, but the river paths south of Folly Bridge. Marked with pencil, a small cross near the water's edge. People mark maps only when they plan to go somewhere, or when they intend never to return. Lewis muttered that the man had been obsessed. Poems about drowning, music about exile, a map to the river. But obsession has edges that cut in directions logic rarely traces. I opened the top drawer of his desk. Neatly arranged pens, a single fountain pen with a cracked nib, and beneath them, a key with no twin. Not on the returned ring, its handle worn smooth. A key not surrendered, a lock not yet found. Lewis asked what I thought it opened. I said that secrets rarely choose ornate doors. We stepped back into the room's center. Dust motes floated toward the window's pale light, as though the air itself were trying to escape. The keys in my pocket felt heavier now, like coins paid to a ferryman one hopes never to meet. On the far wall hung a small framed print of the Cherwell at dusk. The water, rendered in muted blues, held a sheen that could be mistaken for contentment, unless one had stared long enough into rivers to know how easily stillness deceives. Kestrel chose that image deliberately. Perhaps he found comfort in it, or warning. Lewis finally asked the question that had hovered between us. Did we believe Kestrel was still alive? I gave no answer. The room had already offered its opinion. I locked the door again when we left, unwilling though I was to disturb the keyhole's recent betrayal. The keys rattled in my pocket, impatient, like metal bones unsettled by the silence ahead. Walking back through the quad, I studied the returned ring once more. 4 keys accounted for. 1 missing. The absent spoke louder than the clink of those that remained. Sometimes a man vanishes, not because he wishes to be lost, but because he wishes something else to be found. Romantic love, in my experience, rarely travels in the direction one intends. It veers sideways, collides with the unworthy, attaches itself to the absent, or bruises those foolish enough to believe in reciprocation. As Lewis and I climbed the steps toward Dr. Felix Montjoy's rooms, I could not help wondering which direction Helena's affection had taken, and how far it had misled all of us. Montjoy greeted us with a smile that tried too hard to be careless. His room smelled of expensive tobacco and pages left too long in the dark. He was a man who curated his environment the way some curate reputations, carefully, obsessively, hoping no one notices the cracks. He gestured toward chairs that bore the indentations of meticulous living. Straight backs, polished wood, no softness invited. He spoke at length about Kestrel, though I had not asked him to. A fine man, he said. Brilliant. Too brilliant, perhaps. the kind of brilliance that draws admiration like moths to a flame, sometimes burning them. Mountjoy's tone, though smooth, carried an undercurrent sharp enough to cut. Jealousy rarely announces itself politely. Lewis asked if the two tutors were close. Mountjoy answered quickly that they were colleagues, nothing more. A dismissal delivered a fraction too fast. He then added that Kestrel kept mostly to himself, which I found interesting considering Mountjoy seemed intimately versed in the nuances of Kestrel's character. People often betray themselves not through what they hide, but what they claim not to know. As he spoke, Mountjoy absent-mindedly traced the rim of his wineglass. His fingertip paused whenever he mentioned Helena. I remarked gently that she seemed quite affected by Kestrel's disappearance. Mountjoy's smile hardened into something inflexible. "A talented girl," he murmured, with a tendency toward attachment. It was said with the dismissive air of a man who once enjoyed that attachment and now resented where it had been redirected. On the mantelpiece, framed photographs revealed more than Mountjoy wished to disclose. A summer party in the quad, laughter, gowns, wilted flowers worn too long in one's hair. In one photograph, Mountjoy stood beside Helena, his hand almost but not quite touching her shoulder. Frozen in an intimacy he seemed unwilling to commit to entirely. Behind them, blurred in the background, Kestrel's gaze fixed on the pair. Not disapproval, not envy, but something quieter. Concern, perhaps. Or caution. Mountjoy poured himself more wine, but did not offer it to us. Hospitality, like love, was selective here. He asked if we suspected foul play. I noted silently the use of the word "we." He wanted to feel part of the investigation, as though his involvement granted him safety. Men who fear implication often volunteer their presence too eagerly. Lewis brought up the letter, and Mountjoy's fingers tightened around the glass stem. A faint tremor. He said he knew nothing about Hardy, though I could see several volumes of Hardy's collected poetry on his shelf, their spines softened by use. He insisted Kestrel had left of his own will, likely needing a break from the demands of academic life. His voice, however, betrayed that he had rehearsed the sentiment, a line spoken too many times to sound spontaneous. A book lay open on his table, a treatise on classical tragedy. A ribbon marked a page discussing the fatal entanglement of desire and remorse. Mountjoy noticed my interest and closed the book too sharply, the sound louder than necessary. That sound held guilt. "You're reading too much into things," his silence told me. People vanish for all sorts of reasons. But the truth was simpler. People do not vanish from Oxford without leaving someone behind who knows exactly why. Lewis asked whether Mountjoy envied Kestrel. Mountjoy laughed, but the laugh had no echo. He said a man like Kestrel invites admiration, certainly, but also frustration. He paused, then added that Kestrel had a habit of interfering, particularly in matters that did not concern him. The swallow that followed was steeped in resentment. As we prepared to leave, my gaze landed on his desk once more. A discarded postcard, half hidden beneath papers. Folly Bridge at dusk, a soft pencil cross marking the same riverbank, circled on Kestrel's map. Mountjoy noticed my attention and carelessly swept a stack of journals over it, an action too quick to be casual. Outside, descending the stairs, Lewis said Mountjoy seemed harmless enough. I did not reply. Harmlessness is a facade worn by those who have not yet acted upon their darker impulses. Romance, I reflected, rarely chooses the deserving. It attaches itself to longing rather than kindness. Helena had loved the wrong man too much, and Mountjoy had loved the right woman too little. Somewhere in the tension between those mismatched affections, Dr. Adrian Kestrel had walked a line far too fine for comfort. Some loves misdirect the heart, others misdirect the truth. St. Bartholomew's lecture hall had the peculiar gift of preserving echoes longer than voices. Even in the day's thinning light, it seemed a place meant for a secret spoken only once. The chalkboard still bore the faint outline of elegiac couplets, as though memory refused to let go of its unfinished lesson. Lewis flicked the switch near the door, and a row of lights buzzed awake reluctantly, illuminating rows of empty benches that smelled of old varnish and the anxious sweat of examinations long past. Kestrel had been scheduled to deliver the annual night lecture here, an event that was meant to elevate poetry above mere academic exercise. Posters still clung to the notice boards outside, boasting his talk, the voices of the Thames in Hardy's verse. A title that felt heavier now, considering how much of this case kept returning to water and memory. The podium stood prepared. A glass of water, untouched and coated in dust, waited near a stack of lecture notes clipped into a folder. The first page, still present, read simply, "Where the river speaks, and who listens." Beneath, a correction in his handwriting, "Who refuses to." Lewis paced the aisle while I lingered near the chalkboard. I traced the dusty marks with the back of my hand, noticing the indentations of erased questions, scribbled with agitation rather than pedagogy. Kestrel's penmanship was usually precise. Here, the lines dipped and stuttered as if he had wrestled his thoughts into place and lost more than he won. Lewis remarked that someone had gone to great trouble to prepare for a lecture that never took place. The college administration claimed the cancellation was sudden, due to illness. Yet no one in Oxford seemed to recall Kestrel looking unwell. Emotional collapse masquerades convincingly as physical ailment. I found myself wondering which version of sickness had claimed him. On one of the benches lay a small scrap of paper, torn hastily from something larger. I retrieved it carefully, a stanza, incomplete. Her voice, though silent, threads the deep, a secret tide that shadows keep. No attribution, but Hardy's cadence lingered unmistakably. Water once again, absence once again, and someone drowning in metaphor. Lewis asked why the lecture had been cancelled if Kestrel's keys were only returned days later. I did not answer. Time in Oxford rarely progresses linearly. Events occur first in the mind, then in the world. We stepped behind the lecture podium, where a side door led into a cramped antechamber, storage for props and projectors. The air inside tasted of abandonment. A coat hook stood empty, apart from a single tag that read, "Dr. A. Kestrel." The absence of his coat seemed to echo louder than if it had remained there, waiting for its owner to reclaim it. On a small table sat a stack of handwritten cards. I shuffled gently through them, quotations, observations about river folklore, scribbled reminders. Ask about the missing girl. The handwriting wavered along that single note, a question Kestrel meant to pose publicly, or one he feared the answer to. Lewis mentioned the drowned woman whose name kept emerging like a corpse rising against its will. He asked if we believed Kestrel had known her. I told him belief was dangerous in investigations. We work in probabilities, not faith. Yet I could not shake the thought that Kestrel's erasures, his corrections, stemmed from knowledge too intimate to ignore. We returned to the main hall. The polished floor reflected our shapes in wavering strips. Those reflections fractured as we walked, like the surface of a disturbed river. I caught myself imagining Kestrel pacing here days earlier, rehearsing words he would never speak, tracing steps that led him away from safety. A draught slipped through the cracked window near the top rows, causing a lectern pamphlet to rustle like a restless memory. I picked it up. The back bore a note. He will expose everything, the first pronoun crossed out, replaced by I, then crossed out again, a struggle within the self, a confession rewritten into silence. Lewis noticed my pause and asked what I'd found. I said only that guilt has terrible penmanship. He frowned, not quite understanding, and resumed his methodical search. I stood alone in the center of the room. The ceiling, high as a cathedral's ambition, pressed the weight of history downward. Kestrel had stood here once, breathing in the same air, preparing to reveal something he feared and needed spoken. The Thames has always been a witness, to triumph, to tragedy, to bodies surrendered to its depths. Perhaps Kestrel intended not a lecture, but a reckoning. The water heater clicked somewhere behind the walls, the pipes groaning like tired pews settling after prayer. The sound lingered, soft as the last note of a requiem. Lewis called from the far wall. No sign of a struggle. Everything left as it should be, and yet everything wrong. We locked the hall behind us. The key turned stiffly, as though reluctant to acknowledge its own duty. When the latch clicked shut, the corridor seemed darker than before. As we walked away, I replayed the fragment of poem, the rewritten lecture notes, the crossed-out pronouns. A man trying to speak and failing, a voice stifled by someone else, or by himself. Some truths are intended for a room full of listeners, others drown before the first sentence is spoken. There are places in Oxford where time grows waterlogged, where the world refuses to move forward because memory has anchored itself to the riverbed. The Thames, or the Isis, as scholars insist when they wish to prove their authenticity, was such a place. That evening, Lewis and I walked the towpath beneath a sky that struggled to let go of the day. The air smelled of damp leaves, and the river wore its usual expression, unreadable, indifferent, and vaguely amused by human sorrow. The boatman waited near his narrow vessel, running his thumb along the rim of a chipped mug. His face held that peculiar stillness belonging to men who witness more than they are prepared to share. Lewis approached him first, the gravel crunching beneath his shoes. The boatman squinted as though we carried questions heavy enough to break the surface tension of the river he knew too well. He remembered Kestrel. A late evening, 2 nights before, the tutor vanished. Voices raised, not quite shouting, but close to it. The boatman described the scene without embellishment. A wine bottle gripped by one hand, a tremor in the other. A woman, her hair catching the last scraps of twilight, standing too close, then too far, then close again, as though tugged by invisible tides. Helena, of course. Poets don't hide well in nature. They blend into the scenery like metaphors waiting to be discovered. The boatman admitted he tried not to listen, but fragments forced their way to him. Something about confession. Something about betrayal. Something about drowning. Not literal, he believed, but a drowning of trust or loyalty. Their gestures, he said, had told the story more clearly than their words. Helena reaching once for Kestrel's arm, then pulling back as if burned. Kestrel turning away, refusing an apology too late to matter. Lewis asked whether their quarrel seemed violent. The boatman shook his head, water glistening in his eyes like reflected moonlight. No violence, he said, only sorrow that had sharpened itself into blame. I pictured the wine bottle, red glass glinting like a warning, passed between them not as celebration, but as accusation. Wine can reveal truths people never meant to speak, or truths they wished someone else would. The boatman pointed to a patch of reeds where Kestrel had stood after Helena walked away. Alone, he lingered there, gazing into the water as though considering whether it was deep enough to swallow memory whole. And then Kestrel placed the bottle on the riverbank, turned his collar up against the wind, and left in the direction of Folly Bridge. His stride slow, each step resisting the pull of unseen currents. Lewis thanked the man, but I lingered. I asked if Kestrel had been alone when crossing the bridge. The boatman hesitated. He thought he had seen another figure farther along the path. Tall, shoulders hunched beneath a long coat. No words spoken. Shadows do not converse. They wait. We left the river behind, but it followed us. Its sound a quiet insistence beneath the city's heartbeat. We crossed under the bridge's arch, and in the dimming light, I saw the faint remnants of chalk graffiti, drawn arrows pointing downward, as though the river itself were demanding we look beneath its surface. Lewis asked if I believed Helena capable of something drastic. I told him capability was irrelevant. Emotion does not require capacity. It invents it. Yet her fear earlier had not been the fear of discovery. It had been the fear of memory. That is a different terror altogether. A cyclist passed, splashing through a puddle large enough to mimic a lake in miniature. Ripples spread outward. I found myself thinking about the drowned woman, the one whose tragedy had slipped into print last year. The timing, the theme, the recurrence like a refrain. Hardy would have recognized the pattern. He always did. We paused on the bridge. A street lamp buzzed overhead, light trembling upon the water like a nervous confession. I leaned on the railing, the stone cold beneath my palms. Lewis asked what I saw. Not the what, I said quietly. The who. On the far bank, ivy clung to a brick wall, dark tendrils obscuring something metallic caught among the leaves. Lewis retrieved it, his hand emerging with a familiar shape. A bottle opener, the same wine stain along its handle as the bottle I imagined shared between Helena and Kestrel. Someone had tossed it aside, or dropped it in haste. Objects left behind often speak more honestly than people do. Lewis wondered aloud if Helena returned later to the river. I didn't answer. My thoughts were elsewhere, on a man crossing this bridge hoping the night might forgive what daylight refused to ignore. As we turned back toward the college, I felt the river's gaze on my back. Some currents are patient. They pull not with force, but with inevitability. Kestrel had walked a line too close to the edge. And now, like the wine that stains the lips of confessions, the truth would seep through, one drop at a time. I glanced once more toward the reeds where the boatman had pointed. The river swallowed the view, calm and complicit. Some drownings begin long before the water touches skin. Morning arrived with a grayness so absolute it felt as though the sun had reconsidered its obligations. Lewis and I stood on the embankment near Folly Bridge, the river thick and reluctant beneath us, its surface marked by the slow churn of a police launch. The divers moved with quiet efficiency, professionals accustomed to the cruelty of routine. A shout traveled across the water. The sound carried a weight I recognized all too quickly, discovery masquerading as accomplishment. The body surfaced awkwardly, as though unwilling to return to a world that had abandoned it once already. Limbs stiffened by the night's cold, clothes heavy with guilt or river silt. I could not yet determine which. When they laid him on the bank, mud clinging to his hair like remorse, I felt the stillness around us shift ever so slightly. Lewis exhaled. He had expected Kestrel. So had I. But disappointment is an emotion one learns to hide early in this profession. The face revealed beneath the reeds belonged to a younger man, a student, perhaps, and not one whose disappearance had troubled the college enough to summon toasts or keys returned in the dark. The medical examiner knelt beside the corpse, his breath fogging the cold air. A brief murmur. Been here a while. A week, maybe more. Water had softened the truth around the edges, but the features still held a familiarity that teased the edge of recollection. I crouched, careful not to intrude upon the dignity that death strips too easily. The jawline was sharp, the nose slightly crooked, as if broken in some reckless youth. His hands, pale, stiff, bore faint crescent marks, the kind left by fingernails when fear has made the body its last witness. Lewis whispered that the drowned woman from last year had known a man matching this description, a boy expelled quietly and efficiently. Oxford's preferred solution to problems that threaten its carefully polished veneer. A name surfaced in my mind like a buoy rising. One of the faces in Helena's scorched photograph, a connection so small it nearly vanished, until someone drowned for the trouble. I stood and studied the path leading back to the bridge. The river reflected nothing. Not clouds, not sorrow, not truth. A river that keeps its secrets deserves respect, or fear. The divers returned to the launch. The examiner zipped the body bag with a reverence that sounded too much like finality. Lewis spoke of notifying next of kin, though his tone suggested he doubted such calls would be welcomed. Young men expelled from university rarely maintain close ties. I drifted back to the water's edge, the reeds whispering with each gust of wind. Something gleamed half-submerged among them, a scrap of fabric perhaps, or a fragment of intention. I reached in, ignoring the cold that bit like reprimand. My fingers closed on a button, brass engraved faintly, not from the dead student's coat. "Clothing tells stories better than people do," Lewis asked if I thought the two cases were linked. He offered theories about revenge, romantic collapse, drunken accidents. Each theory felt like a borrowed coat, ill-fitting and eager for return. I told him that the dead rarely speak in direct sentences. They leave fragments of words, and it is the living who create grammar from grief. We walked away from the scene, our shoes leaving prints darker than the damp ground should allow. The college spires stared across the rooftops, accusing in their silence. I wondered how many tragedies these stones had recorded over centuries, and how many they had quietly edited from their official history. A cyclist passed with the urgency of someone late to a tutorial, blissfully unaware of the death that clung to the river behind him. Life insists on continuing. It rarely asks permission. Lewis stopped at the bridge's midpoint, looked down. He said if Kestrel had fallen in, we would have found him by now. Bodies don't hide well, but hopelessness is patient, and rivers know where to keep their promises. I said nothing. My thoughts traveled backward to Helena's trembling gestures, Montjoy's carefully curated indifference, the letter inked with desperation, the missing coat key in Kestrel's drawer. Puzzle pieces that refused to settle comfortably together. The wrong body in the water did not bring relief. It brought urgency, because now we knew the river was not done speaking. Lewis asked what we should do next. I stared down at the passing current, the slow turn of leaves caught in the flow. I imagined how easily a man could convince himself that surrendering to the water might wash guilt clean or preserve a secret no longer bearable. But Kestrel had not surrendered. Someone had made the choice for him. The divers prepared for another sweep. The river widened its silence, daring us to guess what else lay beneath. Some truths drift just below the surface. Some sink deeper, waiting for the right moment to rise. Some puzzles are assembled not by adding pieces, but by turning one over. I found myself late that night in Kestrel's room again, unwilling to let the silence dictate the narrative. The air carried the faint scent of old ink and stubborn certainty. I lit the desk lamp, its circle of light a small defiance against the gathering dark. The crossword remained where we had left it, its solitary solution absent, carved with a pressure that suggested more than impatience. I traced the grooves left by his pen. If he had changed his mind while writing, perhaps he had changed his meaning as well. Lewis had urged me to rest, to approach the case with clearer eyes in the morning. But the mind resists clarity when truth approaches. Rest becomes its own form of avoidance. I poured a measure of whiskey from Kestrel's neglected bottle. A futile attempt at borrowing courage from a man no longer capable of offering his own. On the desk, beneath a stack of articles, I found the letter again. The misquoted Hardy line stared back at me. Time changes everything, except memories. The ink had bled where the writer hesitated, or regretted. I lifted the page closer to the lamplight, noticing something I should have seen before, a faint indentation just below the sentence. A second line erased, pressed into the paper like a conscience trying to speak. I tilted the page toward the light until the ghost letters appeared. The river remembers. A half-truth, rewritten. Someone had tried to bury meaning beneath ink, just as someone had buried bodies beneath the Thames. I set the letter down, heart tapping the desk as though it too had been carved too deeply. That erased phrase was not Kestrel's voice. It lacked his restraint. It read as a threat disguised as poetry. A warning written by someone who knew precisely what they were referencing. Helena's smudged ink on her anthology. Montjoy's sudden defensiveness at the mention of Hardy. The photograph with its burned-out face. A trio of truths circling the same unspoken center. And then, that missing key in Kestrel's drawer. A lock unclaimed, secret still sealed. I moved to the bookshelf, drawn to the anthology I'd handled earlier. Opening it again, I searched for handwriting, comments, anything that might betray urgency. Midway through, a page corner folded just enough to suggest intention. The marked poem, about a woman pulled beneath the water's still reflection. I noticed a margin note this time. Faint pencil, hastily rubbed out, he knew. Followed by a blot of ink where the writer panicked and tried to conceal it. The erasure was Helena's style, not Kestrel's. She used ink only when emotion overruled caution. Yet the real revelation arrived with the faintest scrape under the desk drawer. I pulled it open fully and discovered a second, slimmer drawer hidden beneath the first. Shallow, designed for things one wished to forget without entirely relinquishing them. Inside, a photograph. I lifted it carefully, dust loosening like sighs. The image showed Kestrel with two others. The drowned student, alive then, smiling at a future he would never inhabit. And the woman whose death had gone unclaimed by justice. They stood beside the river, casual and unresolved, unaware that tragedy already leaned close. Montjoy's handwriting, sharp and slanted, marked the back. Only one mistake. A cryptic accusation with too many possible targets. Lewis's voice echoed from memory. "Do you believe they're connected?" It was no longer a question. The drowned woman, the expelled student, and the vanished tutor formed a chain where every link strained under guilt. Someone had misquoted Hardy not in ignorance, but in design, altering the line to shift meaning. Time changes everything except that which we carry within. Kestrel would never simplify that truth. But someone else already had. Twice now. Montjoy, the classicist masquerading as indifferent. Montjoy, who closed books too, abruptly. Montjoy, who crossed out his own confession in postcard ink. I stared again at the crossword. One word, one absence. And beneath it, the eraser dust, the ghost of a previous certainty. Absent had replaced something more revealing. I brushed the page lightly. A fragment of the erased word appeared, AAD abandoned. Absence suggests choice. Abandonment demands responsibility. Kestrel had not left. He had been left behind. Rain began tapping the window pane, insistent and uninvited. The river outside, swollen with secrets, seemed to murmur accusation through the night. I imagined Kestrel standing where land hesitates before submitting to water, the poem still clutched in his hand, knowing too much. Lewis would return in the morning, ready for practical steps and procedural certainty. But the case was no longer obeying procedure. It had shifted into poetry. Poetry written by frightened hands, erased by guilty ones. I turned off the lamp. The darkness settled like ink drying over truth. The misquote was no mistake. It was the first confession. It was early when the call came, though time had already lost any shape resembling comfort. Lewis's voice carried that strained control I had heard too often. A discovery made not with triumph, but with resignation. I walked to the river alone. Some journeys demand silence. The reeds parted reluctantly under the boots of officers who wanted to be anywhere else. Their murmurs drifted like mist, brittle, uncertain. By the time I reached them, the stretcher lay waiting on the bank, a shape beneath a heavy tarp, outline unmistakable. The inspector in me stepped forward. The man in me wished to turn away. Water does strange things to the dead. It softens sharpness, dims certainty. As they drew back the tarp, what remained of Adrian Kestrel confronted the dawn. His hair slicked to his skull, his face ghost pale beneath the river's long embrace. A coat clung to him like a question. His eyes were closed, though I suspected they had not been when he first sank. Lewis murmured something about closure. I tasted bitterness in the word. The reeds whispered as a breeze dragged itself along the bank. They looked like mourners, those tall, slender silhouettes leaning inward, respectful, complicit. I crouched beside the body, careful not to let sentiment cloud detail. Kestrel's hand had been curled, not loose, as though he had clutched at something before surrendering to the water. No bruising around the wrists, no sign of struggle in the clothing, a death designed to mimic despair. Lewis shifted uneasily. He suggested suicide, the quiet escape of a man burdened by guilt. I heard myself say that guilt does not wrap keys in newspaper and return them with courtesy. Men planning departure do not leave unfinished lectures or torn envelopes hinting at answers still worth speaking aloud. And then I noticed his collar had been turned up against the cold, deliberately. That small kindness rarely accompanies an act of self-destruction. Someone had arranged him to appear peaceful. I brushed a knuckle lightly against the coat's fabric, gathering a fine grit from the sleeve edge. Not river silt, earth. Fresh, soft, the kind scattered near pathways rather than beneath the water. He had been dragged, not far, but far enough. Lewis walked a few steps away, pretending to study the flow. He hated when I spoke to the dead. Yet I could not stop myself. I whispered that we had listened poorly, that we had insisted on the wrong story. The river remained unmoved, as always. Officers lifted the stretcher. A drop of water fell from Kestrel's hair onto the mud. It seemed a final punctuation. They carried him past us, careful hands holding what once held brilliance. I waited until the river swallowed the view again. We paced along the bank, searching for the recent disturbance that had brought him here. A flattened patch of reeds revealed the spot. The ground sagged beneath my step, as though the earth had tired of shouldering secrets. I knelt, letting my fingers skim the soil. There, a small indentation, barely a mark. The corner of a shoe, imprint unfamiliar to me but too large to be Helena's. Lewis noted that few come here at night, which meant whoever brought Kestrel had known where he would not be seen. Familiarity is its own betrayal. I turned toward the bridge. In daylight, its stone appeared gray and indifferent, but shadows clung to the underside, places perfect for hiding both sorrow and sin. The postcard resurfaced in my memory. The penciled cross. Montjoy's hand covering it too swiftly. Lewis asked whether we should visit him next. I said only that guilt would not be found in his rooms. Not openly. It would flicker in the way he reached for his wine-glass, in a sentence spoken too smoothly, in the tremble of a scholar's hand feigning steadiness. The water beside us rippled, nudged by currents that cared little for human consequence. I imagined Kestrel here, breathing fast, heart warring with fear, words choking against the inevitability of silence. Had he tried to reason? Had the river been a final confidant? The reeds swayed again, their slender forms bowing as if acknowledging a truth just risen to the surface. Some endings settle slowly, like sediment drifting to rest. Not this one. This ending lodged sharp beneath the skin, insistent, unresolved. Lewis returned to my side, face tight with thoughts he did not yet speak. He looked at me then, waiting for clarity. I offered none. Clarity is a luxury. We deal in fragments. But one fragment refused to disappear. The wrong body found first. A grim diversion orchestrated to buy time, or hope. Kestrel's death had not been a sudden collapse of will. It had been planned, intended, executed with knowledge of how rivers mask violence. We began walking back toward the waiting cars. Sunlight scraped weakly across the water, unable to warm anything it touched. Behind us, the reeds resumed their vigil. We had retrieved the body. We had not yet found the truth. I've always believed wine reveals character. It softens the edges that intellect works so hard to sharpen. It was that belief which led me, well after dusk, back to Montjoy's rooms. A bottle of college claret set upon his table, breathing quietly like a confidant awaiting betrayal. He poured with an eagerness that felt like self-medication. His hand trembled just enough for a drop to tremor down the bottle's neck before falling to the carpet. A single stain, blooming like guilt, allowed air. He asked if Kestrel had suffered. Not a question for an innocent man. We sat. The chairs were as rigid as his posture, both protesting inevitable collapse. He spoke first, but his sentences arrived tangled. Declarations without context, assurances no one requested. Kestrel was fragile. Kestrel was reckless. Kestrel was burdened by knowledge no man should carry. I let his words pool uselessly for a while. Wine filled his glass faster than honesty did. The lamplight behind him trembled whenever he shifted. He talked of Helena as though she were an idea rather than a person, a symbol of misguided longing. He said she had adored Kestrel with the desperation of someone afraid to be ordinary. I suspected Montjoy feared the same fate. He tried to insist that Kestrel's death was tragic but inevitable. That love, poorly returned, had destroyed him. He spoke as if rehearsing a eulogy for a man he never mourned. I allowed silence to answer him for a time. Then, gently, I placed the brass button from the river bank on the table between us. It rolled slightly, catching the lamplight. Montjoy's eyes followed its movement with the dread of someone recognizing a shadow they cast long ago. He attempted an explanation, a tale of lending his coat, of misunderstanding. But a lie is always too quick to its own defense. He reached for his wine again, but the glass remained on the table. His hand hovered halfway, suspended between defiance and collapse. I said I had seen the postcard, the penciled cross by the river, the hurried attempt to hide it, the handwriting he thought too obscure to notice in a moment of carelessness. Still, he resisted. So I mentioned the expelled student, the drowned girl, how Kestrel had taken an interest in their story, not as academic curiosity, but as conscience. A tutor who believed he might prevent tragedy from repeating itself. Montjoy's mouth tightened. There it was, the first fracture. He whispered that the dead girl had been foolish, that she had mistaken attention for affection, that the student had manipulated her, and Kestrel had planned to expose everything to save the college from scandal. His voice wavered when he spoke of Kestrel threatening to reveal the truth, of reputations on the line, of careers balanced precariously upon perception rather than fact. Montjoy swallowed hard, as though attempting to dissolve his own remorse. He said he only meant to confront Kestrel by the river, to persuade him, to protect Helena, or perhaps himself, from the consequences of honesty. But persuasion is a delicate art, and fear makes a dangerous accomplice. He paused then. His hand finally found the wine-glass, gripping it too hard, as if he wished it could shatter first. He said Kestrel lost his footing, that the reeds caught him only after the river had chosen. A misstep, he insisted. A mistake, a tragedy without villainy. But his eyes betrayed him. There is a sound people make when the lies run out. It is quiet, Like an answer someone hoped not to hear. His confession arrived not in words, but in a nod. Slow, sinking, the final act of a man surrendering to the truth he could no longer outrun. A nod that acknowledged not murder in fury, but cowardice in silence. He let the river decide what he could not bear to. Lewis emerged from the adjoining room, having heard enough. Handcuffs waited. Montjoy did not protest. He only asked for one more sip of wine. Lewis glanced at me. I allowed it. The glass touched Montjoy's lips like a final indulgence. He placed it down without finishing. The claret left a dark ring upon the wood, the shape of guilt preserved in stain. When they led him away, he did not look back. I remained in the chair a moment longer, absorbing the stillness. The lamplight flickered once, relieved or saddened. I couldn't tell. The open bottle watched me from the table, half emptied by confession. I poured the last measure into my own glass. I drank it slowly, letting sorrow settle on my tongue. Justice, when finally spoken, is never triumphant. It leaves the room with a limp. The chapel was too small for the kind of silence it attempted to contain. Light filtered through stained glass in thin, reluctant ribbons, painting the wooden pews with fragments of forgotten saints. The college choir sang softly, a hymn chosen more for its familiarity than its comfort. I stood at the back, unable to rid myself of the habit of watching people even when they believed themselves unobserved. They placed an empty chair near the lectern, draped in Kestrel's college scarf, its fringe gently brushing the stone floor, a gesture meant to honor the absent. But absence does not sit still. It lingers instead in the unspoken, in the flicker of downcast eyes, in memories that refuse to be organized neatly into eulogies. Helena was there, seated near the aisle, her posture a failed attempt at composure. She gazed ahead, though not at the chair and certainly not at the master offering solemn words. Her hands held a handkerchief crumpled tight enough to crack. Grief, I thought, had chosen her as its unfinished sentence. Lewis, beside me, shifted awkwardly in his formal jacket. He whispered, barely audible, that justice had been served, a tidy phrase spoken by a man who still believed in tidy endings. I envied him his conviction. When the choir fell, quiet, the master invited anyone with memories of Kestrel to speak. No one stood. Their affection for him, though occasionally professed, had always been cautious, admiration from a distance. In academia, love is often conditional, loss rarely acknowledged aloud. The organ groaned one final chord, and the congregation began its exit, shoes tapping against stone like rainfall trapped indoors. I remained where I was until the church warden cleared his throat, the universal signal for departure. Outside, the air smelled of old leaves and damp pages. A reception awaited in the dining hall. Tea for the pious, whiskey for the honest. I suspected I knew which Kestrel would have chosen. Lewis urged me forward, but I stayed a moment longer to glance back at the chapel doors, now closing with a sigh that seemed far too human. The hall was bright with conversation attempting bravery. Laughter arrived too suddenly, too loudly, the kind that insisted on moving past sorrow before sorrow had agreed to be left behind. Glasses clinked in muted celebration of an ending no one wished to define. There, on the long table, stood the same claret Montjoy had poured in his confession. Its bottle now bore a black ribbon, a redemption of sorts, or a mockery. I poured a small measure into my glass. The wine caught the light briefly, a crimson echo of everything that had gone wrong along the river's edge. Helena approached, footsteps hesitant. She asked whether any of it, the investigation, the truth, the public ritual of closure, had made a difference. Her eyes searched mine for a certainty I've never trusted. I told her only that remembering is a kind of justice too, though justice rarely feels merciful. She nodded, though understanding faltered. She admitted she had loved Kestrel. Not wisely, never reciprocated, but genuinely enough to break something inside her she doubted could be repaired. I found no words worth giving her. Silence sometimes is the least harmful answer. Lewis returned to my side, a plate of untouched sandwiches in one hand. He asked whether I believed Kestrel had found peace. The phrasing struck me as too hopeful. Peace, if it exists at all, arrives without guarantee. A bell sounded in the quad, a single toll marking the hour. Its echo drifted inside the hall, passing over the gathered academics like a cold draught none wished to acknowledge. The empty chair at high table stared back with its quiet, unyielding testimony. The master raised his glass then, asking us to honor a colleague taken too soon, a scholar who loved the river and the verse that shaped it. He used words like tragedy and brilliance, but avoided guilt, avoided blame, avoided anything resembling truth. The toast rang out. To Adrian Kestrel. A chorus of repetition followed. Glasses lifted, eyes lowered. I raised mine as well, though not in unison. A solitary motion, late by a second or two. An imperfection Kestrel would have noticed, and perhaps appreciated. The claret warmed my throat. Fleeting, inadequate, but real. The ceremony continued without me. I left the hall quietly, stepping into the open quad where dusk had begun to gather its shadows. The grass shimmered faintly with the day's condensed sorrow. From where I stood, the river was out of sight, but not out of mind. Water remembers, even when we pretend not to. I walked toward the gate, the city beyond breathing with its habitual indifference. The air tasted of unfinished lines. I imagined Hardy scribbling a final stanza somewhere in the margins. Absence, I reflected, is not the opposite of presence. It is a presence amplified. I paused beneath the arch, glass still in hand, and whispered a private farewell. A toast not to the man everyone tried neatly to mourn, but to the one who had tried quietly to save the truth from drowning, to the tutor who refused to forget. The night breeze replied with a soft rustle of unseen leaves. Not acceptance, not comfort, just acknowledgement. Some toasts linger long after the glasses are lowered. Some griefs choose to stay.